Hey guys, tonight we are stepping somewhere that most people only dream about. And by the end of this, you will understand exactly why dreaming is the only safe way to do it. Picture this. A narrow slit in the desert rock face, half buried under 2,000 years of wind-blown sand. The temperature already dropping as the Egyptian sun sinks below the horizon like it has somewhere better to be. The smell hits you first, dry, ancient, mineral, with something underneath that you cannot quite name and probably do not want to. Your torch flickers. The shadows lean in. And somewhere deep in the stone corridor ahead of you, something shifts. It is probably just settling rock. Probably. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least the acoustics in here are fantastic. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you are listening from somewhere wonderfully far from an Egyptian desert, maybe a rainy bedroom in Manchester, a humid apartment in Manila, or a suspiciously quiet house in rural Ohio, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing who is out there in the dark with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing at the entrance to an ancient Egyptian tomb, and the first thing you need to understand is that you were not supposed to get this far. The ancient Egyptians were not naive. They did not carve millions of tons of limestone, import cedar wood from Lebanon, and commission an entire theological operating system for the afterlife just to leave the front door open for curious visitors with a torch and a vague sense of adventure. Every single element of what you see before you, and more critically, what you cannot see, has been engineered across centuries of architectural and spiritual refinement to make sure that the person who enters this space without permission does not leave it in any condition to tell the story. But here you are anyway. Let's talk about what you are up against. The entrance itself is almost insultingly small. You imagined something grand, didn't you? Perhaps a soaring gateway, hieroglyphs blazing in gold, maybe a pair of enormous stone guardians flanking a ceremonial arch. And to be fair, some of the more theatrical tombs in the Valley of the Kings do offer a certain dramatic flair: carved lintels, painted door jambs, the names and titles of the deceased rendered in careful, deliberate script. But the entrance shaft itself? It is roughly the width of a large man's shoulders, if that man has been on a strict desert diet for several months. It descends at a steep angle, and the stone underfoot has been worn smooth not by centuries of tourism, but by the ropes and wooden sleds that dragged the burial equipment inward during the original interment. That smoothness is not your friend. You are going down on your hands and knees within the first 30 seconds, torch held awkwardly to one side, already questioning every decision that led to this moment. The location of this tomb is, on its own, a masterpiece of deliberate inhospitality. The Valley of the Kings, that famous necropolis on the west bank of the Nile near ancient Thebes, modern Luxor, was chosen with extraordinary care. The Egyptians oriented their world around the cardinal logic of the Nile. The East Bank was the land of the living, where the sun rose and cities thrived. The West Bank was the land of the dead, where the sun set and sank into the underworld each night, making its perilous journey through the 12 hours of darkness before rising again in the east. The valley itself sits beneath a natural pyramid-shaped peak called Al-Qurn, which the Egyptians called Dihenit, and which they associated with the goddess Meretseger, she who loves silence. That name alone should tell you something about the neighborhood you are entering. You have arrived in the late afternoon, which felt clever at the time. You figured you would get inside before dark, orient yourself, maybe take some notes. What you did not fully account for is that inside a rock-cut tomb, there is no meaningful difference between afternoon and midnight. The darkness is absolute and total in a way that your modern brain, accustomed to streetlights and phone screens and the ambient glow of a dozen standby LEDs, is genuinely not prepared for. When Egyptologists describe the darkness inside unlit tomb chambers, they use a specific phrase: sensory negation. It is not merely dark. It is the absence of light in a way that your eyes cannot adapt to, because there is nothing, no photon, no phosphorescent mineral, no faint crack of sky, to adapt to. Your torch, a simple oil lamp of the kind that actual ancient visitors would have used, produces about as much useful illumination as a very motivated firefly. And the heat, or rather, the lack of it, is already becoming a problem. The desert above you was sitting at around 40 degrees Celsius when you arrived. Down here, the rock maintains a remarkably stable temperature of approximately 20 degrees year-round, which sounds pleasant until you realize you are sweating from the descent and the adrenaline, and now that sweat is cooling against your skin in the damp dark, and your body is doing rapid, unhappy calculations about its own thermoregulation. You are simultaneously overheated and beginning to get cold, which is the kind of physiological contradiction that ancient Egyptian tomb builders would have found deeply amusing if they had had time to think about visitors instead of, building the tomb. The seal. Let's talk about the seal, because this is where your afternoon took a significant turn before you even started descending. The entrance to any properly prepared royal or noble tomb was sealed. Not locked, not bolted, but sealed, with plaster impressed with the official stamp of the necropolis. The royal seal of the Valley of the Kings was a distinctive design. A jackal, representing Anubis, crouching above 9 bound captives. 9, specifically, representing the 9 traditional enemies of Egypt. When you find a sealed tomb, that seal is a legal and spiritual document simultaneously. Breaking it is not like picking a lock. It is closer to tearing up a contract signed by gods. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptians genuinely believed that breaking a necropolis seal would invoke immediate supernatural consequences, or whether the seal was primarily a practical administrative tool for tracking which tombs had been inspected by the necropolis officials. But what is not in debate is that when the seal was broken without authorization, the consequences from the very human necropolis police were swift and severe. You have already broken the seal to get in. You did not think too hard about it. You are thinking about it now. The other thing you are noticing, as you inch down the entry corridor on your hands and knees, torch gripped in one sweating hand, is the smell. It is extraordinary. Not offensive exactly, not what you might expect from a space that has housed a dead body for 3,000 years. The mummification process and the desiccating properties of the desert rock mean that organic decomposition happened very differently here than it would in, say, a European tomb. What you are smelling is something older and stranger. The residue of the sacred oils and resins that were used during the burial, Kifi incense, myrrh, cedar oil, now so ancient that they have polymerized into the stone walls and exist as a kind of olfactory fossil. Underneath that is the dry mineral bite of limestone and the faintest trace of something almost metallic, which is natron salt, the desiccant used in mummification, slowly leaching from the walls and floor around you. It is, in its own bizarre way, one of the most extraordinary smells you have ever encountered. Deeply alien and yet somehow recognizable in the way that all very old things have a kind of universal ancientness to them. Your brain is filing this under important, remember this, which is optimistic, given your current circumstances. As you ease yourself down the first section of the corridor, you notice that the walls are not bare. Even here, in the entry passage, even in this utilitarian throat of the monument, there are images. Painted in red and black and yellow ochre on a white plaster ground, they are not decorative in any sense you are familiar with. There are no landscapes, no portraits in the modern sense, no scenes of daily life rendered for beauty's sake. What you see are ritual texts and protective formulae, excerpts from the Amjuet, the book of what is in the underworld, which is essentially a detailed hour-by-hour guide to the journey of the sun god Ra through the 12 hours of night. These are not decorations. They are technology. Spiritual engineering applied to the walls of the tomb to ensure that the occupant's soul has access to the information it needs to navigate the afterlife. The fact that you cannot read them is, spiritually speaking, your problem. What you can read, because it has been helpfully translated for you by a century and a half of Egyptology, is the general tenor of many of these inscriptions, and it is not welcoming. As for anyone who shall enter this tomb, reads one formula common to many New Kingdom burials: I shall seize him like a bird, and he shall be judged for it by the great God. Another, found in the tomb of a 19th dynasty official, promises that the tomb owner will wring the neck of violators in the manner of geese. The ancient Egyptians had a remarkably vivid vocabulary for what they intended to do to uninvited guests. And while the scholarly debate about whether these constituted genuine magical curses or merely legal warnings in religious language continues to fill conference papers, you are currently inside the tomb with the inscriptions, and the distinction feels somewhat academic. The entry corridor narrows further ahead. Your torch is producing a thin, wavering light that makes the painted figures on the walls seem to move. A procession of gods and demons gesturing toward the interior with arms that appear, in your peripheral vision, to reach slightly toward you before you look directly at them. This is not supernatural. This is a combination of oil lamp flicker, 5,000 years of slightly irregular paint application, and the fact that your nervous system is currently running a fairly aggressive threat assessment program. But knowing that does not make the painted eyes of Anubis any less attentive. You press forward. The stone presses back. Somewhere behind you, the faint gray smear of the entrance is already gone, absorbed into the dark as if it was never there, and the only direction that exists now is inward. The tomb does not care that you are here. That is perhaps the strangest thing about it. You expected menace, and what you have found instead is indifference. The vast, mineral, absolute indifference of a space that was built for a specific purpose that has nothing to do with you, and which continues to serve that purpose with or without your participation. The weights of stone above you are incomprehensible. The silence is of a quality that makes you aware of your own heartbeat in a way that is, at first, reassuring, yes, still beating, noted, and then, after a few minutes, slightly too loud. You are inside. The seal is broken. The dark is total. Tonight is going to be a very long night. The corridor ahead of you is not going where you think it is going. That is the first and most important thing to understand about the interior architecture of an ancient Egyptian tomb, and it is a lesson that the space itself is about to teach you in the most uncomfortable way possible. You have a mental map. Everyone who enters one of these places has a mental map, assembled from documentary footage and museum diagrams and that one illustrated book you half-read before falling asleep on the couch. Your mental map features a straight corridor leading to an antechamber, leading to a burial chamber, everything arranged in a logical sequence like a very serious apartment with a very specific floor plan. Your mental map is wrong, not slightly wrong. Architecturally, spiritually, and physically wrong in ways that are going to become apparent over the next several hours as the tomb systematically dismantles every assumption you brought in with you. The corridor you are currently crawling through, and you are still crawling because the ceiling has not risen enough to let you stand, and your knees are developing opinions about limestone that they will share with you at length later, descends at roughly a 20-degree angle. This is steep enough to make forward progress feel effortful and backward progress feel inadvisable, like trying to reverse up a playground slide in the dark while carrying a flame. The angle is not accidental. The descent mimics the symbolic journey downward into the do-it, the Egyptian underworld, and it also serves a very practical secondary function. It discourages casual exploration by anyone who is not absolutely committed to the project. You are absolutely committed to the project. Your knees are not. After approximately 30 meters, though your sense of distance underground is already becoming unreliable in a way that would concern a geologist, the corridor levels out briefly and then presents you with a choice that your mental map did not include. There are two openings. They are roughly the same size. They are equally dark. One of them continues the general trajectory of your descent. The other angles off to the left at about 45 degrees and disappears into the rock. There are hieroglyphs above both openings. You cannot read hieroglyphs. You pick the one that continues straight ahead, which feels logical, which is exactly why the architects made it the wrong choice. The deliberate use of false corridors and misleading passages in Egyptian tomb design is one of the more elegant expressions of ancient architectural paranoia. The builders of the New Kingdom royal tombs in particular, those magnificent hypogea carved for pharaohs from Thutmose I through Ramesses XI, developed a sophisticated repertoire of misdirection techniques that would impress a modern escape room designer. False doors were a staple, not the symbolic false doors that appear in Old Kingdom mastaba tombs, which served as spiritual portals for the ka of the deceased and were never meant to be physically opened, but actual carved passages that appear to lead somewhere significant and terminate abruptly in solid rock, sometimes after 20 or 30 meters of corridor that required substantial labor to carve. The message was clear: we will waste your time even with stone. Pit traps were another favored technique, and as you shuffle forward along what you believe to be the main corridor, you are about to make the acquaintance of one. The ancient Egyptians called these features, somewhat bureaucratically, the Great Breach, and they appear in multiple royal tomb plans as rectangular shafts cut directly across the corridor floor, typically between 2 and 5 meters deep, wide enough that jumping across them in a low-ceiling passageway is genuinely difficult, and occasionally lined with additional features at the bottom that the architects preferred not to specify in writing. The shaft ahead of you is not enormous by the standards of, say, the Tomb of Seti I, but it is more than wide enough to swallow your leg to the hip if you do not see it in time, and your oil lamp's illumination radius is approximately 2 meters on a good day. You see it in time. Barely. The flame catches the edge of the far side. A slightly different texture of stone, a faint line of shadow, and you stop with your leading foot about 30 centimeters from the drop. You spend a moment breathing. The breathing echoes oddly in the shaft, bouncing back at you from the invisible bottom with a quality that is not quite an echo and not quite a voice, but is definitely something your brain wants to categorize as the latter. You do not look down into the shaft for long. The question of how to cross it is a practical problem that would have been simple for the original burial party. They used wooden planks, temporarily bridging the shaft during the interment and removing them afterward, sealing the tomb with the pit as an act of defense. You do not have planks. What you have is the width of the corridor on either side of the shaft, which is to say, not quite nothing. There are shallow ledges cut into the sidewalls, barely finger-width projections of stone, that suggest the builders knew someone might need to traverse this gap, or that they were left by the construction process and are purely coincidental. Historians still argue whether these side ledges in certain New Kingdom tombs were intentionally designed as bypasses for authorized priestly visitors performing post-interment rituals, or whether they are simply an artifact of the construction methodology. Tonight, you are treating them as a feature. The crossing takes 4 minutes and removes several layers of skin from your palms. The torch, wedged into your belt for the maneuver, produces a thin stream of black smoke that drifts upward and joins the ancient soot deposits on the ceiling. Because yes, the ceiling above you is already dark with the accumulated smoke of thousands of ancient lamps, left there over the years of construction and ceremonial visitation like a geological record of every flame that has ever burned in this corridor. You are adding to that record. This is genuinely one of the few contributions you are making to this space that the space seems to accept without complaint. On the far side of the pit, you stand up for the first time in what feels like a geological era, and the corridor has finally, grudgingly, as if the tomb resented the concession, expanded enough to allow it. You are now in a passage roughly 2 meters high and 1.5 meters wide, and the sudden ability to stand upright produces a wave of physical relief that is almost emotional. You roll your shoulders, you stretch your neck, you hold the torch up and actually look at where you are, and what you see is extraordinary enough to briefly override the terror. The walls here are fully decorated, not the preliminary painted plaster of the entry corridor, but carved and painted relief work of a quality that stops you mid-breath. The cutting is extraordinarily fine. Shallow sunk reliefs carved directly into the limestone, then painted with a palette that has survived millennia in the dark with colors still vivid enough to be startling. Lapis blue and malachite green and the particular warm red-orange of Egyptian ochre, all laid out in registers, horizontal bands of imagery stacked from floor to ceiling, depicting scenes from the underworld journey. Gods with animal heads conduct ceremonies. The deceased, rendered in the idealized profile of Egyptian artistic convention, makes offerings, passes judgments, speaks words of power. The hieroglyphic text runs in columns between the figures, dense and purposeful, and every square centimeter of wall surface has been considered and utilized. The effect in torchlight is overwhelming. The flickering light gives the reliefs a depth and animation that static electric lighting completely destroys, and this is one of the genuine quirks of tomb archaeology, the fact that these spaces were designed to be seen by lamplight, that the artists who created them calibrated their cutting depth and color saturation for the warm, mobile illumination of an oil flame, and that every modern visitor who experiences them under fluorescent tubes installed for tourist safety is seeing them in a lighting condition their creators never intended and would not have recognized. You are seeing them correctly. This is either a privilege or an additional layer of danger, depending on how you look at it. The corridor turns. This is the next item on the architectural agenda of disorientation. Egyptian tomb corridors are rarely straight for their entire length. They bend, sometimes gently and sometimes at sharp angles, for reasons that are partially geological, following natural fissures in the rock, avoiding underground water. Partially cosmological, aligning different chambers with different symbolic directions, and partially practical, making it harder to remove large objects by creating angles that a sarcophagus-laden sled cannot easily navigate. The bend ahead of you is roughly 90 degrees to the right, and as you follow it, your mental map performs another quiet collapse, because you are now oriented in a direction that feels like it should be toward the cliff face, toward the outside, toward the sun, and you are absolutely still going deeper in. This is one of the more insidious features of extended time underground, the complete failure of your directional instincts. Above ground, humans navigate using a combination of visual landmarks, the position of the sun, the topography of the landscape, and a barely conscious proprioceptive sense of north that is less reliable than we like to imagine but functions adequately in daylight. Strip all of that away, no sun, no landmarks, no topography visible, no starlight, and the underground navigation system that remains is almost comically inadequate. Studies of people placed in featureless underground environments show that without external reference points, human beings will consistently believe they are walking straight while actually curving, will systematically underestimate the distances they have traveled, and will rapidly lose confidence in estimates of elapsed time. You have been in this tomb for, you check mentally, what feels like about 40 minutes. It has been 2 hours and 15 minutes. Your phone, which has no signal here and never will, confirms this with an indifference that mirrors the tomb's own. The next obstacle the architecture presents is a chamber, a roughly rectangular room that opens suddenly from the corridor like a held breath released, and the chamber is not empty. It contains, distributed across its floor with a casualness that suggests either deliberate arrangement or the aftermath of ancient looting, a collection of objects. Large ceramic storage jars, their lids sealed with mud that has dried to the consistency of concrete. Wooden boxes, black with age, their surfaces painted with figures that have mostly flaked away. What appears to be a chair, a small, lightweight chair of the kind used by scribes or minor officials, sitting in the corner at an angle as if its occupant just stood up. And in the far wall, perfectly centered, a door. Not a corridor. A door. A rectangular opening framed with carved stone, painted with a winged sun disk above the lintel, the symbol of royal protection, and flanked by 2 figures of Anubis, seated, alert, ears up, watching. The door beyond opens into darkness so complete that your torchlight does not penetrate it at all. It simply stops at the threshold, absorbed. The Egyptians had a word for the threshold between the world of the living and the underworld. The Ake, the horizon, the place where 2 realms touch and neither fully claims. Standing at this doorway, looking into that absolute dark, the word seems suddenly less metaphorical than it did this morning. The quirky architectural footnote that most visitors to reconstructed tomb diagrams miss is that in several 18th dynasty tombs, most famously in the tomb of Thutmose III, whose burial chamber is shaped like an elongated oval meant to evoke the body of a cartouche, the sarcophagus was specifically positioned so that its head end faced a particular wall, orienting the deceased's mummy to face a specific set of texts at the moment of their resurrection. The tomb's architecture, in other words, was not just a container but a machine, a precisely calibrated spiritual device that only functioned correctly when every element was in its design position. You are currently standing in the middle of this machine. You are not a designed element. The machine does not know what to do with you, and the feeling, as you stand at that threshold with your tiny flame and your 2-hour time deficit and your scraped palms, is entirely mutual. You step through the doorway. The floor on the other side is 2 steps lower than the floor you just left, and you find this out the hard way. The ceiling, however, is suddenly much higher, for meters, maybe 5, and the walls, when your recovered torch illuminates them, are covered from floor to ceiling on every surface, every inch, with text and image so densely applied that the wall itself seems to breathe under the lamplight. You are in the antechamber, or something that functions as one, and the scale of what surrounds you, the ambition and the labor and the absolute theological seriousness of it, produces a feeling that is not quite fear and not quite awe but lives in the neighborhood of both. Quiet and very large and impossible to explain to someone who has not stood in this specific dark. Deeper in, something is waiting. You can feel it in the way the air moves, or rather, in the way it does not. The air in here is trying to kill you. Not dramatically, not with any malicious intent. The tomb does not hate you, It simply does not care about you, and the atmosphere it has maintained for 3,000 years is optimized for the preservation of the dead, not the comfort of the living, and those two priorities turn out to be almost perfectly opposed. You noticed something was different about the air the moment you crossed that threshold into the antechamber, and you probably attributed it to the density of the space, the weight of the stone, the psychological pressure of the painted walls closing in. Some of that is accurate. But there is something more specific happening in the chemistry of every breath you take down here, and the more you understand it, the less comfortable the next several hours are going to be. Start with the oxygen. You are accustomed to air that is approximately 21% oxygen, a ratio your body has calibrated itself to over an entire lifetime of breathing it without thinking about it. The air in a sealed or semi-sealed underground chamber, depending on its degree of isolation, its volume, and the nature of the organic materials it contains, can sit significantly below that figure. The oxidation of ancient organic matter, the slow, patient chemical consumption of wooden furniture, linen wrappings, papyrus scrolls, dried food offerings, and the resinous coatings applied to virtually every surface during the burial process, consumes oxygen on a timescale of centuries and produces carbon dioxide in its place. In a chamber that has been sealed for a significant portion of those 3,000 years, the oxygen content can drop to 18 or 19%, low enough to be measurable, low enough to begin producing subtle physiological effects that you might not immediately attribute to your environment. At 19% oxygen, the effects are mild. A slight increase in breathing rate, a faint sense of effort during physical exertion that seems disproportionate to the activity, a very subtle dulling of complex cognitive tasks. You might notice you are breathing a little harder than the gentle gradient of the corridor seems to warrant. You might find that the mental arithmetic of navigation, how far have I come, how far back is the entrance, how much oil remains in this lamp, feels slightly stickier than usual, requiring a second pass to produce a result you trust. You might dismiss both of these things as the natural consequence of stress and physical effort in an unfamiliar environment, which is the correct dismissal, right up until the oxygen level drops another percentage point and the correct dismissal becomes slightly harder to construct. At 17%, headaches arrive. Not immediately, not all at once, but with the creeping patience of something that has been planning this visit for a while. A tightening behind the eyes. A quality of pressure at the temples that you initially attribute to dehydration. You are dehydrated, that part is accurate. And then to the stress of the confined space, and then to nothing in particular, because by the time the headache is established enough to demand a diagnosis, your capacity for accurate self-diagnosis has already been quietly compromised by the same cause. This is the genuinely insidious quality of mild hypoxia. It impairs the very cognitive functions you would use to identify and respond to it, creating a loop of decreasing competence in which the person least able to recognize the problem is the person most affected by it. The ancient Egyptians, for their part, were not ignorant of the atmosphere problem, even if they lacked the chemical vocabulary to describe it accurately. The workers who carved and decorated these tombs, we will spend considerable time with them later because they are genuinely fascinating people, reported to their supervisors when air quality in a cutting became unworkable, and the standard solution was to introduce ventilation shafts, small, angled channels cut upward through the rock to the surface, designed to create a passive airflow by exploiting temperature differentials between the hot surface air and the cooler underground atmosphere. Several royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings contain these shafts, and the identification of their primary function, whether ventilation during construction, ventilation during ceremonial use, or purely symbolic channels connecting the tomb to the sky, remains one of those pleasantly unresolved questions that keeps Egyptologists productively disagreeable at conferences. What you can say with confidence is that the ventilation shaft, if one exists in this particular tomb, is not providing meaningful airflow tonight, because the air around you is absolutely, completely, comprehensively still. Still air underground is a specific sensory experience that is difficult to convey to someone who has not encountered it. Above ground, even in the most sheltered indoor spaces, there is always micromovement, the convection currents generated by your own body heat, the pressure differential created by a closing door somewhere in the building, the imperceptible breathing of a structure that expands and contracts with temperature changes. Down here, none of that applies. The air is not merely calm. It is static in a way that feels almost solid, as though it has been standing in place for so long that it has forgotten how to move. Your torch flame, which has been your most reliable indicator of air movement since you entered, is burning in a column so perfectly vertical that it looks painted. When you breathe out, your exhalation drifts directly back toward your face with nowhere else to go. And then there is the fungus. This is the part that tends to generate the most visceral response when people learn about it, and understandably so, because the idea of a 3,000-year-old biological passenger making itself at home in your respiratory system is the kind of thought that keeps rearranging itself into new uncomfortable configurations the more you examine it. Egyptian tombs, particularly those containing organic materials, which is to say all of them, have been found to harbor a remarkable variety of microbial and fungal life. Aspergillus niger, a black mold with a particular affinity for organic substrates, has been documented in multiple tomb environments. Various species of Penicillium, Cladosporium, and Alternaria have been cultured from tomb air and surfaces. These organisms are not, in most cases, aggressive pathogens in the clinical sense. They are not lurking in the dark, specifically awaiting the opportunity to infect a healthy adult with a functional immune system. But a healthy adult with a functional immune system who has been breathing tomb air for several hours while physically exerting themselves in a low-oxygen environment is not necessarily presenting that immune system's best work. The spores that drift invisibly through the static air around you, dislodged from wall surfaces by your movement through the chamber, are not more dangerous than the mold you might encounter in a damp basement. They are, however, more ancient, more thoroughly adapted to their particular substrate, and more concentrated in a space with no ventilation and no dilution from fresh air. The condition that some researchers have proposed as a partial explanation for the famous pattern of early deaths among certain members of the team that opened Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, and historians still argue whether this epidemiological pattern reflects genuine biological hazard, statistical coincidence, or journalistic amplification of a compelling story, has been retrospectively labeled by some as a combination of Aspergillus exposure and compromised immune function in older researchers spending extended periods in recently opened tomb environments. You are currently a researcher spending an extended period in a tomb environment. Your immune system is doing its best. Give it a round of applause. The smell, which you noticed immediately upon entry and have been experiencing as a layered olfactory archaeology ever since, is now revealing new registers. Underneath the kiffy and cedar and mineral dryness of the outer chambers, the antechamber has its own distinct atmospheric signature, contributed by whatever organic materials have been sitting in here for 3 millennia doing their patient, invisible chemical work. There is something almost sweet in it, not pleasant sweet, but the sweetness of very old organic compounds in slow transformation, the distant cousin of the smell of very old books, pushed into stranger territory by the resins and natron and the particular chemistry of desiccated linen. There is also something you might describe as earthy, though that is not quite right. It is earthier than earth, more mineral, less biological, with an undertone that your brain keeps trying to classify as animal and keeps failing to place exactly. You are also, at this point, becoming aware of a sound, or rather, of the way that sounds behave in this space, which is unlike the way sounds behave anywhere you have been before. The antechamber has a specific acoustic signature determined by its dimensions, the material of its walls, and the degree to which those walls absorb versus reflect sound waves. Stone reflects. These particular limestone walls, coated in layers of plaster and paint that have hardened over millennia into something approaching a ceramic surface, reflect very efficiently. The result is a reverb that is not quite an echo, too fast for a true echo, too short to be called a reverberation in the musical sense, but a quality of sound that makes everything you hear feel slightly larger than its source. Your footstep sounds like someone larger stepping. Your breath sounds like two people breathing. The occasional small sounds that you are generating simply by being alive and present, the shift of fabric against stone, the faint tick of your cooling lamp metal, the involuntary sounds of a body doing its continuous biological maintenance, all arrive back at your ears with a slight delay and a slight enlargement that makes the space feel populated in a way that careful logical reasoning does its best to address and never quite succeeds. The ancient Egyptians were not unaware of the acoustic properties of their constructions. Several researchers studying ceremonial spaces in temple complexes have noted the apparent deliberate engineering of acoustic effects. Chambers where a chant or a spoken formula would resonate at particular frequencies, amplifying certain ritual sounds in ways that would have been powerfully experiential for participants in torchlit ceremony. Whether similar acoustic consideration went into tomb design is a more complicated question, since tombs were not intended for extended human occupation after sealing, but the fact remains that the spaces produce remarkable sonic environments, and you are currently the only living source of sound in one, which means every noise you make comes back to you slightly changed, and the silence between your noises is of a quality and completeness that the word silence was not really built to carry. The lamp. You need to think about the lamp. Your oil lamp is a simple, beautiful object. A shallow terracotta bowl with a pinch spout, filled with castor oil, the fuel of choice in ancient Egypt, cheap, plentiful, and producing relatively little smoke compared to animal fat alternatives, though relatively little is doing significant work in that sentence in an unventilated underground chamber. The wick, a twisted length of plant fiber, is consuming oil at a rate that your visual estimate of the remaining fuel converts into a runtime of approximately 3 more hours. This is a generous estimate. The actual runtime, accounting for the fact that you have been holding the lamp at various angles during your crawling and clambering, and that some fuel has almost certainly sloshed out during the pit crossing maneuver, is probably closer to 2.5 hours. After that, you will have the darkness that exists in here, which is, as previously established, the kind of darkness that has a physical weight and presence. The carbon dioxide your lamp is producing is worth considering alongside the carbon dioxide your own respiration is adding to the space. A single human at rest exhales approximately 200 milliliters of carbon dioxide per minute. Physical exertion increases this to 800 or more. Your lamp, burning castor oil, adds its own contribution to the CO2 budget of the chamber. In a sealed space of the dimensions you are currently occupying, you estimate roughly 8 meters by 5 meters by 3 meters high, a volume of about 120 cubic meters, though this estimate is very rough because geometry is difficult in the dark. The combined output of you and your lamp is measurably, progressively changing the atmospheric composition of the air you are breathing. Here is the oddly reassuring fact buried in all of this: the same atmospheric conditions that are gently undermining your cognitive function and slowly enriching the CO2 content of your personal breathing environment are also, simultaneously, the conditions that have preserved the objects, the paintings, the texts, and the wrapped and anointed body in the innermost chamber with extraordinary fidelity. The dry, still, dark, sealed environment that is challenging your biology is a near-perfect conservation medium for everything that the tomb was actually built to protect. The paint on the walls is still vivid after 3,000 years because no humidity has attacked it, no UV light has faded it, no ventilation currents have abraded it. The wooden furniture in the corner of the antechamber has survived because the moisture content of the air is so low that the organisms capable of digesting cellulose cannot establish viable colonies. Even the food offerings, the dried figs, the sealed jars of oil, the bundles of grain placed here to nourish the deceased through eternity, survive in a desiccated but chemically recognizable form. The tomb is perfect for the dead. This is a design success. You are not dead. This is your design problem. You sit down on the floor of the antechamber gently, carefully, because you have learned your lesson about unexpected drops, and hold the lamp up and look around at everything the light can reach. The painted gods look back from every surface with the patient attention of beings who have been doing this for 3,000 years and expect to be doing it for 3,000 more. Somewhere in the still air above you, invisible biological passengers drift on currents that only they can perceive. The oxygen content of the air you are breathing continues its slow, arithmetic decline, one breath at a time. You take a breath, then another. The lamp burns its patient, irreplaceable oil. You are doing fine. You are doing absolutely fine. Your head hurts a little, which is probably just the stress. Somewhere in the rock above you, 3,000 years ago, a man named Panub was causing problems. This is not unusual. Panub was constitutionally incapable of not causing problems, and the administrative record of the village of Deir el-Medina, the purpose-built community that housed the workers who carved and decorated the royal tombs of the New Kingdom, contains enough material about Panub specifically to fill a moderately entertaining biography and a fairly alarming police report. He was accused, across the course of his career, of theft from a royal tomb, assault on a superior, corruption of the water supply, and what the ancient Egyptian legal record describes with magnificent bureaucratic restraint as improper behavior with multiple married women. He was also, by all surviving accounts, an exceptionally skilled craftsman, because the ancient Egyptians understood, as many institutions since have struggled to, that talent and conduct exist on entirely separate administrative tracks. You are thinking about Panab because you are sitting in the antechamber of a tomb that men like him built, and the air in here, thin and old and full of invisible biological stowaways, as we have established, was once full of the sounds of their work. The chipping of copper chisels against limestone, the scratch of reed brushes on fresh plaster, the particular vocabulary of men doing hard physical labor in a confined space, which in any culture and any century tends toward the colorful. The tomb around you is not just a monument and not just a machine and not just a spiritual document. It is also a workplace, and the people who worked in it were among the most remarkable, most thoroughly documented, and most surprisingly relatable workers in the entire ancient world. Deir el-Medina sits in a natural hollow in the hills on the west bank of the Nile, tucked between the Valley of the Kings to the north and the Valley of the Queens to the south, positioned with the bureaucratic logic of a community that needed to be close to both its worksites and far enough from the general population to maintain the secrecy that knowledge of royal tomb locations required. At its height during the 19th and 20th dynasties, the era of Ramesses the Great and his numerous successors, the village housed approximately 60 to 120 workmen and their families, a population of perhaps 400 to 500 people living in a compact grid of mud brick houses along a single main street, surrounded by a wall that was less about defense and more about administrative clarity regarding who was inside and who was outside. The workforce was divided into two gangs, the left gang and the right gang, terminology borrowed from the nautical organization of a boat crew and applied to the two sides of a tomb corridor under excavation simultaneously. Each gang had a foreman, a deputy foreman, a scribe, and a complement of specialized craftsmen, stonecutters who did the initial carving, plasterers who prepared the walls for decoration, draftsmen who laid out the compositions in red grid lines before the master painters arrived, painters who applied the color, and sculptors who cut the relief work into the plaster surface. There were also supporting workers, water carriers, who made the journey to the Nile and back every day to supply the worksite, and a laundryman, which strikes the modern reader as an almost touchingly domestic detail in a list of otherwise fairly dramatic professions. The state provided everything: housing, grain rations, fish, vegetables, pottery, salt, natron, and the wicks and oil for the lamps that lit the underground workspace. When supplies were late, and they were late with a regularity that suggests the ancient Egyptian supply chain had some of the same fundamental challenges that have plagued logistics in every civilization since. The workers noted it, formally and with impressive procedural precision, in the administrative records that have survived. The world's oldest recorded labor strike occurred at Deir el-Medina in approximately 1170 BCE, during the reign of Ramesses III, when the workers' rations failed to arrive for the 18th day of the month and the gangs downed tools and marched past the guards, past the administrative boundary of the necropolis, into the mortuary temples on the floodplain, and sat down and refused to work until someone with authority addressed their grievances. Their recorded statement to the officials who came to negotiate is a document of such dignified, controlled frustration that it reads as entirely contemporary. "We are hungry. We have no clothes. We have no fish. We have no vegetables. Write to Pharaoh our good lord about it, and write to the vizier our superior, that sustenance may be made for us." They got their rations. They went back to work. The tomb they were building at the time was completed on schedule. You are lying on your back now on the antechamber floor. You decided sitting was not ambitious enough for the headache, and staring up at the ceiling, where the lamplight picks out a band of astronomical imagery, yellow stars on a deep blue-black ground, arranged in the constellations of the Egyptian sky, the hippo goddess Tauret anchoring one end of the celestial register, the bull's foreleg representing what we call Ursa Major hanging at the other. This ceiling was painted by someone, a specific person with a specific name, who stood on a wooden scaffold in this room with a pot of blue pigment and a reed brush and painted these stars one by one in the flickering light of an oil lamp very much like the one currently dimming at your side, and who then went home to Deir el-Medina and ate dinner and complained about whatever the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a Monday was. The pigments themselves are worth a moment of appreciation, because they represent a supply chain of remarkable geographic ambition. The blue you are looking at is Egyptian blue, cuprorovate, a synthetic pigment manufactured by heating a mixture of copper compounds, calcium, and silica to high temperatures, one of the earliest artificial pigments in human history, and one that produces a color of extraordinary stability, which is why it is still vivid above you now. The green on the walls of the adjacent corridor is malachite, ground copper carbonate, sourced from mines in the Sinai Peninsula. The red and yellow are iron oxides, relatively local. The black is carbon, the most democratic of pigments. The white is powdered calcite. And the gold, where gold appears, in the jewelry of the depicted figures and the solar discs of the gods, is actual gold leaf, applied over a gesso ground with an adhesive so well formulated that it has remained adhered for 3,000 years of complete darkness. The craftsmen who applied these materials were not anonymous artisans producing generic religious imagery from a standardized template, though the compositional conventions of Egyptian funerary art are strict enough that a non-specialist might assume otherwise. Within those conventions, the profile head, the frontal eye, the composite figure that shows each body part in its most legible aspect rather than its most realistic one, individual artists developed recognizable styles, personal touches. Art historians studying Deir el-Medina have identified what appear to be individual hands at work across multiple tombs, craftsmen whose careers can be partially traced through the stylistic signatures they left in the dark rooms they decorated and never saw again after the tomb was sealed. The workers' own tombs, because the craftsmen of Deir el-Medina were entitled to prepare their own tombs in a dedicated cemetery adjacent to the village, and many of them did so with a thoroughness that reflects both professional pride and significant personal investment, are in some ways more artistically adventurous than the royal tombs they built by day. Released from the strict iconographic requirements of the royal program, the Deir el-Medina craftsmen painted their own afterlife visions with a creative freedom that includes images of the deceased playing board games, tending gardens, watching dancers, and reuniting with pets, alongside the standard religious formulae. One tomb owner had himself depicted playing the game of Senet, a board game analogous in some ways to a combination of chess and backgammon, and deeply loaded with symbolic resonance about the journey through the underworld, and the game board depicted is rendered with enough detail that modern game historians have been able to reconstruct likely rules from the image. The working day at the tomb site was organized around a schedule that the surviving records reconstruct with surprising precision. The gangs worked in 10-day shifts. The ancient Egyptian week was 10 days, not 7, a fact that your groggy, oxygen-compromised brain is finding oddly comforting right now. The idea that even the fundamental unit of time was organized differently here, with rest days built in for religious festivals, which were numerous. The Egyptians celebrated somewhere between 60 and 80 festival days per year depending on the period, which means the actual proportion of days worked versus days celebrated was considerably more favorable than many modern employment contracts provide. Historians still argue whether this festival calendar represents genuine religious observance, a practical management strategy for keeping a workforce in a socially coherent community, or some complex mixture of both that the ancient Egyptians themselves would not have experienced as separable. The tools the workers used tell their own story of supply chain and material constraint. The primary cutting tool for limestone was a copper chisel. Bronze became more common in the later New Kingdom as tin imports from distant sources became more reliable, but copper remained dominant throughout much of the period. Copper is significantly softer than the limestone and sandstone being cut, which means the chisels required constant resharpening and frequent replacement, a logistical demand that the administrative records track meticulously. The village had its own copperworking facilities for reworking blunted chisels, and the rate of copper consumption per unit of rock removed was carefully monitored by the scribes. Because copper was valuable and the temptation to pocket-worn chisels rather than return them for recycling was apparently irresistible to a significant proportion of the workforce, given the frequency with which the records address this specific issue. The lamps, because of course you are thinking about lamps, given that yours is doing something concerning at the edge of your peripheral vision, were a critical supply item and a significant administrative headache. The underground workspace required continuous illumination, and the castor oil that fueled the lamps was allocated per gang per shift, with the expectation that skilled lamp management would keep the workspace illuminated for the full working period. The smoke produced by the lamps was managed partly by the ventilation shafts already discussed and partly by the simple expedient of keeping the lamps trimmed and the wicks at a length that minimized incomplete combustion. The soot deposits on tomb ceilings, including the ones above you right now, dark and soft-looking as velvet, represent the accumulated evidence of thousands of lamp hours of underground work, the physical residue of every hour those men spent in the dark cutting stone and applying paint in service of someone else's eternity. There is a specific detail from the Deir el-Medina records that tends to produce a strong reaction in people hearing it for the first time, and it concerns the darkness. The workers, descending into the tombs each morning with their oil lamps and their copper chisels, were working in conditions of near-total sensory isolation from the world above. No sunlight, no wind, no natural sounds except the muffled vibration of hammers and chisels transmitted through rock. The records document cases of workers requesting relief from underground assignments, citing illness, claustrophobia, family obligations, with a frequency that suggests the psychological burden of the work was recognized and administratively managed. There were surface jobs, quarrying the limestone blocks for above-ground structures, preparing materials, administrative duties. Workers rotated between underground and surface assignments, and the records of individual workers' duty assignments show a pattern of rotation that looks, to modern occupational health eyes, remarkably like a structured exposure management program. They knew. They did not have the clinical vocabulary, but they knew that spending too long underground in the dark did something to a person, and they organized their workforce accordingly. The man who painted the ceiling above you, those careful yellow stars, that precise blue ground, probably went home at the end of his shift and stood in the sun for a while before he did anything else, feeling the warmth on his face with the specific appreciation of someone who has earned it by a morning spent in the absolute dark. Your lamp is definitely dimmer. You sit up and check the oil level with a fingertip the way you have seen done in reconstructions, and the way the ancient workers would have done it dozens of times per shift. The oil is lower than your earlier estimate, significantly lower. The arithmetic of your remaining illuminated time is revising itself downward with the cheerful efficiency of bad news. You think about those workers, Panub with his impressive rap sheet and his excellent craftsmanship, the unnamed painter of the astronomical ceiling, the water carrier making his daily trek to the Nile and back, the scribe who recorded the first labor strike in human history with the careful, neutral handwriting of someone who knew the document might outlast the civilization, and you feel, unexpectedly, a warmth that has nothing to do with the temperature. These were people. Fully, completely, specifically people with grievances and talents and bad habits and moments of looking up from their work in the dark to see what they had made, illuminated by the same quality of flickering light that is illuminating you now. They built this place and went home. You came here voluntarily. In terms of the decision-making on display, the historical verdict is clear. The eyes are the first thing you notice, not the gods themselves. Not the towering figures of Osiris with his crook and flail, not the precise animal heads of Thoth and Horus and Anubis arranged in their ritual processions across every wall surface, but specifically the eyes. Egyptian artistic convention renders the eye in full frontal view regardless of the angle of the face, a compositional choice that modern art historians categorize as conceptual rather than perceptual representation, meaning the artist depicts what is known to be true about a face rather than what a specific viewpoint would reveal. The result, in the flickering intimacy of your oil lamp, is that every single figure on every single wall appears to be looking directly at you, not in the direction of you, not approximately toward you, at you specifically with the focused and unblinking attention of beings who have been waiting in this particular dark for 3,000 years and have some thoughts about your arrival. This is not supernatural. You know it is not supernatural. You are a reasonable, modern person with a working knowledge of Egyptian artistic convention and a mild headache that is definitely just dehydration. And you know with complete intellectual certainty that the painted gaze of a new kingdom deity is a function of compositional tradition and not evidence of actual divine surveillance. You know this, and yet, the knowing sits in one part of your brain while the reacting sits in another, older, considerably less reasonable part, and those two departments are not currently in productive communication. The theological architecture of what is watching you deserves some explanation, because understanding what the ancient Egyptians believed was happening on these walls changes the quality of the experience in ways that are difficult to predict. The images are not, in the Egyptian understanding, representations of gods. They are not illustrations. They are not decorative. They are, in the precise theological sense that the Egyptian religious system maintained with extraordinary consistency across 3,000 years of continuous practice, presences. The act of carving or painting a divine figure in the correct ritual context, with the correct accompanying texts, and with the correct ritual intentions, was understood to instantiate a real aspect of that deity's power in the physical space of the image. The god did not merely look like Osiris. It was Osiris, or rather, it was a genuine manifestation of the divine energy that Osiris represented, anchored to this specific wall in this specific tomb by the craft and the intention of the artists who created it. This is why the destruction of images in Egyptian tombs was taken so seriously as both a crime and a strategy. When later rulers sought to erase the memory of a predecessor, as Horemheb systematically erased the cartouches of the Amarna pharaohs, and as various political actors throughout Egyptian history attacked the images of fallen officials, they were not merely vandalizing art. They were, in the Egyptian understanding, performing a precise spiritual operation, eliminating the divine presence of that individual from existence by destroying the material anchor that sustained it. The name and the image together constituted the person, in an afterlife sense, and without them the person simply ceased to persist. You are surrounded by intact names and intact images, which means every presence the tomb was designed to contain is, from the Egyptian theological perspective, fully operational. The specific beings currently watching you from the walls of the antechamber include a roster that reads like a who's who of the more alarming sections of the Egyptian pantheon. Anubis, naturally, appears multiple times. He is the god of embalming and the guardian of the necropolis, and his jackal-headed figure flanks every significant threshold in the tomb with the alert posture of a security professional who takes his work seriously. Directly across from where you are sitting, rendered in a scale that makes him roughly twice your height even in painted form, is Osiris, the god of the dead, the lord of the underworld, the judge of souls, depicted in his characteristic mummy wrap with the green skin that indicates resurrection and the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt and the crook and flail crossed over his chest with a precision that suggests these objects are not ceremonial but operational. His eyes, frontal as established, are outlined in thick black kohl that makes his gaze approximately impossible to escape regardless of where in the room you position yourself. Thoth is here too, the ibis-headed god of writing and knowledge and cosmic balance, which is appropriate given that his primary function in the afterlife judgment scene is scribal. He records the result of the weighing of the heart, the great cosmic assessment that every Egyptian soul underwent after death, in which the deceased's heart was placed on a balance scale against the feather of Ma'at, truth, justice, cosmic order, rendered as a single white ostrich feather and weighed. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul proceeded to eternal paradise. If it was heavier, burdened by the moral weight of a life poorly lived, a creature called the Amit, the devourer, waited beside the scales to consume it, ending the soul's existence permanently and completely. Thoth wrote it all down. The Egyptians had strong feelings about documentation. The Amit is also present, which you discover when you move your lamp to examine the lower register of the east wall, where the judgment scene plays out in its full procedural detail. The devourer is a composite creature, the front half of a crocodile, the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, the middle section of a lion, and it is depicted beside the scales with an expression that the ancient artist has managed to make simultaneously alert and patient, the expression of something that has all the time in the world and knows exactly how this ends. The Amit is not a god in the full sense. It is more of a cosmic enforcement mechanism, a spiritual consequence given animal form, and it is not worshipped or propitiated or addressed with prayer. Simply waits. It is waiting right now in the lower register of the east wall, about 2 meters to your right. You shift slightly to your left. The inscriptions on the walls are not idle decoration either, as previously noted, but it is worth spending a moment with their specific content because the texts in this antechamber are drawn from a particular body of funerary literature with a character all its own. The Book of the Dead, known to the Egyptians as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, a title that is both more optimistic and more precisely descriptive than its modern name, is a collection of spells, formulae, and instructions for navigating the afterlife, compiled and revised across centuries of Egyptian religious practice and existing in hundreds of individual versions, each customized to some degree for its specific owner. The version on these walls includes Spell 125, the declaration of innocence spoken before the divine tribunal at the moment of judgment, in which the deceased formally denies a specific list of sins before a panel of 42 assessor gods. The list of denials in Spell 125 is a document that rewards close attention, both for what it includes and for what its inclusion implies about the behaviors that required specific denial. I have not stolen. I have not robbed with violence. I have not been covetous. I have not stolen food. I have not swindled offerings. These are expected. But the list continues. I have not been eavesdropping. I have not been hot-tempered. I have not been deaf to words of truth. I have not been boastful. And further, I have not polluted myself. I have not done that which is abominable to the gods. I have not caused harm to a servant by his master. The ethical scope is remarkable. It encompasses economic behavior, social conduct, personal temperament, ecological responsibility, and the treatment of people in subordinate positions, all held to the same cosmic standard by the same set of divine eyes. Historians still argue whether the negative confession represents a genuine ethical code that ancient Egyptians were expected to actually follow, a ritual formula that was effective regardless of the actual conduct of the deceased, or something in between, a statement of aspiration that carried weight precisely because it was made before divine witnesses even when its literal truth was approximate. What is not in debate is that the text was taken seriously enough to be carved into tomb walls at enormous expense, and that the theological framework it represents, a universe with moral structure, where behavior has cosmic consequences, where the truth of a life can be weighed against an absolute standard, was the operating assumption of Egyptian civilization for the better part of 3 millennia. The 42 assessor gods are depicted above the text, arranged in 2 registers, each with their name and their specific domain of judgment. The god who assesses honesty in speech, the god who assesses honesty in commerce, the god who assesses behavior toward the vulnerable. They are looking at you too. You have not committed most of the sins on the list. The eavesdropping one is ambiguous. The hot-tempered one is between you and the gods. The protective texts on the walls operate on multiple levels simultaneously, which is characteristic of Egyptian religious writing generally and gives it a quality of layered meaning that rewards slow reading, or would, if you could read it. At the most immediate level, these are warnings to the uninitiated, declarations of the tomb owner's divine protection that function as spiritual no-trespassing signs. At a deeper level, they are operational instructions for the tomb's divine residents, specifying what actions are to be taken in response to various categories of intrusion or disturbance. And at the deepest level, they are part of a continuous cosmic maintenance program. Texts that, simply by existing and being legible, keep the theological machinery of the tomb running, sustaining the divine presences in the walls and ensuring the ongoing welfare of the deceased soul in the underworld. There is a specific class of protective text called an execration text, from the Latin execratio, a cursing, in which the names or depictions of enemies, threats, and malevolent forces are written or drawn and then ritually destroyed, broken, burned, buried, or spat upon. The Egyptians maintained lists of enemies of the cosmic order, foreign peoples who represented chaos, dangerous animals, malevolent spirits, and performed regular rituals of execration to neutralize their power. Some of these texts were deposited in tombs. Some were buried at the base of walls. Some were inscribed on figurines that were then smashed. The process was repeated regularly because the enemies of order were understood to require continuous, active suppression rather than a single definitive defeat. You are not listed in any execration text, technically. The tomb owners who prepared these specific protections did not know you were coming. But you are, from the perspective of the theological system operating on these walls, a category of intrusion that the protections are designed to address, an unauthorized living presence in a space consecrated to the dead, disturbing the ma'at, the cosmic balance, the right order of things, that the tomb's elaborate systems were installed to preserve. You are, in the language of Egyptian cosmic taxonomy, an agent of Isfet, chaos, disorder, the fundamental opposite of ma'at, the force that the entire architectural and theological apparatus of the tomb was designed to exclude. The eyes follow this logic, their frontal gaze a feature rather than a coincidence, because in the Egyptian theological system, the gaze of a divine figure is not passive observation but active participation. The God who looks at you is doing something to you, assessing, measuring, registering, and the multiplicity of gazes in this room creates an experience of divine attention that is total and omnidirectional. There is no angle from which you can stand in this room and not be watched. It is reasonable to assume, entirely intentional. The quirky footnote to all of this divine surveillance is that the ancient Egyptians had a specific, practical, and almost endearingly bureaucratic solution to the problem of being watched by gods you had not prepared appropriate offerings for. You could, in certain ritual contexts, simply close the divine eyes. Texts describing the preparation of cult statues include instructions for a ceremony called the opening of the mouth, which animated a statue or image by ritually opening its sensory organs, eyes, ears, mouth, nose, allowing the divine presence to inhabit it and engage with the world. Logically, this ceremony could theoretically be reversed, though the sources are ambiguous about whether and when this was done. There was, in other words, an off switch, somewhere, in texts you cannot read, referring to ritual knowledge you do not possess, applicable in a ceremonial context that you are not equipped to execute. You look around the room at all of those frontal eyes. You smile a little because what else do you do? One of the Anubis figures on the north wall appears, in the lamplight, to tilt his jackal head very slightly, the way a dog does when it hears a sound it finds interesting. This is the plaster settling. This is thermal expansion of ancient materials. This is the lamp producing a slight flicker that creates an illusion of movement in painted forms. This is all of those things. You look at your lamp. The flame is smaller than it was an hour ago, burning low and careful, aware of its own limitations in a way that you find briefly irrationally touching. The oil is nearly gone. The eyes on the walls, every last one of them, continue their patient, frontal 3,000-year vigil. You are going to need to move soon, deeper in, toward whatever is waiting at the center of all this attention. The gods watch you get up. They watch you pick up your lamp. They watch you turn toward the inner doorway. They have been watching longer than you can really hold in your head, and they will be watching long after the last trace of your visit has faded into the mineral record of this place. That is either the most alarming thought you have had all night, or the most comforting one, and the distance between those two interpretations is, at this precise moment, very small indeed. The room you step into next is so full of things that your brain, already operating on a reduced oxygen budget and a considerable adrenaline overdraft, simply stops processing for a moment and presents you with a kind of visual static, an overwhelming simultaneity of objects, surfaces, colors, and shapes that refuses to resolve into individual items the way a normal room full of normal things would. You stand in the doorway and blink and hold the lamp up, and the lamp obliges by illuminating approximately 1 cubic meter of the space at a time, which means you are going to have to look at this room the way you read a very long book, sequentially, patiently, one section at a time, and trust that the complete picture will eventually assemble itself in your understanding. It does slowly, and what it assembles into is one of the most extraordinary collections of objects you have ever stood next to, arranged with a logic that is completely coherent and completely alien simultaneously, and which has been sitting here in the dark waiting for exactly this kind of attention for 3,000 years. The ancient Egyptians packed their dead well. This is perhaps the understatement of the archaeological record. The burial assemblage of a wealthy New Kingdom official, and this tomb belongs to someone of significant means, as the quality of the decoration and the scale of the preparation make clear, could include hundreds of individual objects, selected according to a theological and practical logic that governed every category of inclusion with the same careful attention the builders gave to the architectural layout and the decorative program. Nothing in this room is here by accident. Nothing is here for sentimental reasons, exactly, or for the kind of personal memorial logic that leads modern people to bury their dead with favorite objects or meaningful mementos. Everything is here because it serves a specific function in the economy of the afterlife, and understanding those functions turns this overwhelming room into something more like a very well-stocked workshop for the business of eternal existence. Start with the canopic jars, because they are the first thing your lamp finds as you sweep it slowly around the room's perimeter, and they demand attention. There are 4 of them, arranged on a low alabaster chest in the corner nearest the door, and they are beautiful objects, cylindrical alabaster vessels with carved stoppers, each stopper shaped as a different head. A human head, a baboon head, a falcon head, and the head of a jackal. These are the 4 sons of Horus, Imsidi, Hapi, Kabasanouf, and Duamutef, and each one is responsible for protecting a specific organ removed during mummification and stored in its corresponding jar. Imsidi, the human-headed one, holds the liver. Hapi, the baboon, holds the lungs. Kabasanouf, the falcon, holds the intestines. Duamutef, the jackal, holds the stomach. The heart was not removed, it was left in the body because the heart was the seat of intelligence and moral character and the organ that would be weighed at judgment, and its absence from the body during that assessment would have raised serious procedural questions. The canopic jars closest to you contain organs that were removed from a human body approximately 3,000 years ago, processed with natron, wrapped in linen, anointed with sacred oils, and sealed into these vessels with prayers and ritual formulae. The organs are still in there. The alabaster is translucent enough that your lamplight, held very close, produces a faint glow through the vessel wall without revealing any detail of the contents, which is probably for the best. You do not touch the jars. This is the correct decision both archaeologically and, if you are taking the theological context seriously, spiritually. The sons of Horus are watching their charges. You can see their carved faces watching from the stoppers, for different species of divine attention stacked in a corner, and the jackal one, Duamutef, has an expression of such focused wariness that you take a half step back before you consciously decide to. The Shaptis are next, and there are a lot of them. The Egyptian afterlife, for all its cosmic grandeur, maintained a remarkably pragmatic attitude toward labor, and the pragmatism expressed itself in the Shapti, a small mummiform figurine, typically between 10 and 30 centimeters tall, made of faience or wood or stone or pottery depending on the owner's budget, and inscribed with a specific spell, Spell 6 of the Book of the Dead, that animated the figurine to perform agricultural labor on behalf of the deceased when called upon by the divine administrators of the underworld. The logic was impeccable. The afterlife, in the Egyptian conception, included the field of reeds, a paradise of eternal plenty that nevertheless required maintenance, and the gods who administered it would periodically call on the blessed dead to perform tasks. Plowing, irrigating, carrying sand from east to west or west to east, the kinds of agricultural corvée labor that earthly Egyptians were subject to from their lords. The Shapti would answer the call in the deceased's place, standing up at the sound of the summons and responding with the formula inscribed on its body. Here I am, I will do it. A well-prepared New Kingdom burial included 365 Shaptis, 1 for each day of the year, plus 36 overseer Shaptis, 1 for each 10-worker gang, because the ancient Egyptians understood that even magical agricultural labor required supervision. You are looking at approximately that number now, arranged in wooden boxes along the wall, their small mummiform faces staring forward with an expression of patient readiness that is somehow more affecting than the grandeur of the divine figures on the walls. These are not gods. They are workers, rendered in miniature, waiting for a call that may or may not come, prepared to spend eternity doing agricultural labor so that their owner does not have to. The quiet dignity of the Shapti, this small, hard-working, perpetually ready figurine, is one of those details of Egyptian funerary practice that lands differently the longer you sit with it. There is a wooden box near the center of the room that is larger than the Shapti containers, painted black with yellow hieroglyphic bands, its lid fitted so precisely that the join is nearly invisible. Inside, according to the typology of New Kingdom burial assemblages, there would almost certainly be a nested set of coffins, but this box is too small for that. It is the right size and shape for a model boat. The Egyptians placed model boats in tombs throughout much of their dynastic history, reflecting the centrality of the Nile to Egyptian life and the understanding that the afterlife journey would involve extensive travel by water. The solar bark of Ra made its nightly journey through the underworld by river, and the deceased, accompanying the sun god on that journey, would need appropriate transport. Some burials included multiple model boats for different purposes. A traveling boat for the journey north, a traveling boat for the journey south, a boat for hunting in the marshes, a boat for the pilgrimage to Abydos, the sacred city of Osiris. The dead, it seems, had busy social calendars. scattered around the floor, and the arrangement that looks like scattering is almost certainly deliberate, reflecting a specific placement logic that you are not equipped to fully reconstruct, are objects of a more immediately personal character. A wooden headrest, shaped like a crescent moon on a slender column on a flat base. This is not a pillow in any conventional sense, but a neck support that Egyptians actually slept on in life, and which was placed in the tomb so the deceased could continue the nightly practice of resting the head on it. Since sleep and death shared important symbolic territory in Egyptian thought, the daily resurrection of the sleeper prefiguring the ultimate resurrection of the dead. Beside the headrest, a pair of sandals, actual sandals made of woven plant fiber and leather, sized for a specific human foot, because the deceased would need to walk in the afterlife, and walking without appropriate footwear in an environment that included both divine courts and agricultural fields seemed inadvisable. There are jars of food. This is both the most practical and somehow the most poignant category of burial goods, because food is the most immediate, most perishable, most stubbornly mortal of human requirements, and placing it in a tomb involves a kind of defiant optimism that is hard not to find moving. Sealed ceramic jars contain what analysis of similar assemblages suggests would be wine, beer, oil, honey, and grain. There are dried figs in a basket. There is a haunch of beef, now 3,000 years desiccated, wrapped in linen, placed on a wooden tray. There is bread, or what was bread, before the millennia reduced it to a form that occupies the conceptual space between archaeology and geology. All of this food was ritually sanctified at the time of burial, becoming offerings imbued with perpetual divine sustenance by the formulae spoken over them, meaning that from the Egyptian perspective the food in these jars continues to nourish the deceased in the underworld regardless of its current physical condition. The oils and unguents deserve particular attention, partly because several of them are in vessels close enough to examine with your lamp, and partly because they represent a supply chain and a chemistry that illuminate the ancient Egyptian approach to the body in genuinely surprising ways. Alabaster vessels of various sizes contain the 7 sacred oils used in funerary ritual, a specific set of aromatic compounds that appears in Egyptian texts from the Old Kingdom onward, including festival oil, hikanu oil, safed oil, and others whose precise botanical composition remains a matter of ongoing analytical chemistry and scholarly debate. These oils were applied to the mummy during preparation, to the coffin surfaces, and to the walls of the burial chamber itself, layering the tomb in a chemistry of preservation and sanctification that contributes significantly to the olfactory complexity you have been navigating all evening. One of the alabaster vessels near your left foot contains what appears, by its vessel shape and the traces of residue around the sealed lip, to be kifi, the famous Egyptian incense compound that ancient sources describe as a mixture of up to 16 ingredients including honey, wine, raisins, myrrh, frankincense, pine resin, and various aromatic plants. Kifi was burned in temples at sunset, the ancient texts specify, to help the sun complete its journey safely through the night. It was also used medicinally in funerary preparation and, according to a delightfully specific ancient source, as a treatment for anxiety because its aromatic compounds, inhaled slowly, were understood to still the mind and encourage the relaxation that was a prerequisite for successful ritual participation. An ancient Egyptian ASMR aid, essentially, which has been sitting in this sealed jar less than a meter from you, in the dark, for 3,000 years. You cannot open the jar. You know you cannot open the jar. You think about opening the jar. You do not open the jar. The jewelry in the room, and there is jewelry, arranged in a wooden box whose lid has warped slightly in 3 millennia of stable but not perfectly invariant conditions, is another category of object that straddles the boundary between the decorative and the functional in the Egyptian understanding. Collars of faience beads, broad and layered, were placed on the mummy's chest to protect the area of the heart. Amulets of specific shapes, the Jed pillar representing stability and the backbone of Osiris, the Wedjet eye representing healing and protection, the Ankh representing life, the Tayet knot representing the protective power of Isis, were wrapped within the mummy's bandaging in specific anatomical positions, each one corresponding to a spell in the Book of the Dead that activated its protective function. The jewelry is not decoration. It is armor of a theological kind. The quirky detail that tends to produce the strongest reaction when people encounter it in the archaeological literature is the heart scarab. This is a large amulet, typically of green stone, often serpentine or schist, carved in the shape of a scarab beetle and inscribed on its flat base with spell 30b of the Book of the Dead, a text addressed specifically to the heart. O my heart of my mother, O my heart of my mother, O my heart of my different forms, do not stand up against me as a witness, do not be opposed to me in the tribunal, do not be hostile to me in the presence of the keeper of the balance. This is the deceased asking their own heart not to testify against them at judgment. The heart knew everything. The heart had been present for every deed, every thought, every compromise and cruelty and moment of moral weakness across an entire lifetime. The Egyptians were aware of this. The heart scarab was their solution. A preemptive plea for the heart's loyalty, inscribed in stone and placed directly over the organ in question, in the hope that the heart would remember the request at the crucial moment and keep its own counsel. Historians still argue about whether this represents a sophisticated understanding of internal moral conflict, the self-aware recognition that a person's own conscience might be their most credible accuser, or a more mechanical understanding of the judgment process in which the correct ritual actions could reliably produce the correct outcome regardless of the actual content of the life being judged. The question is not entirely unlike debates that have occurred in various religious traditions since, and it is one of those moments where the 3,000-year distance between you and the person whose tomb you are sitting in collapses entirely, because the problem the heart scarab addresses, what do you do when you know your own heart better than you would like to, is not an ancient problem. It is Tuesday's problem, rendered in green stone and placed in the dark. You are surrounded by all of this. The canopic jars with their divine watchers, the patient Shabtis waiting for their summons, the food that has been waiting to nourish someone for 3 millennia, the armor of amulets, the heart scarab's quiet plea, and the room is pressing in with the weight of all that intention. Every object here was chosen, prepared, consecrated, and placed by someone who cared enormously about what happened next. The love embedded in this room, because that is what it is, underneath the theology and the ritual and the administrative thoroughness, a form of love expressed through extraordinary effort on behalf of someone who is gone, is palpable in a way that the headache and the thin air and the failing lamp cannot quite suppress. Your lamp is very low now. The flame has reduced itself to a careful, minimal thing, conserving what remains with an efficiency that feels almost intentional. In its diminished light, the objects around you cast longer shadows, and the room seems simultaneously smaller and larger, contracting around the flame's immediate radius while expanding into the dark beyond it. There is one more room ahead. You can feel it in the way the air, that still, ancient, carefully preserved air, seems to lean in that direction, oriented toward the center of all this preparation, the room for which everything else was prologue. The lamp gutters once, steadies, and burns on. The body got here before you did, obviously, but the journey it took to arrive makes yours look straightforward by comparison. 70 days. That is the number that the ancient sources return to with a consistency that suggests it was not merely conventional but genuinely observed. 70 days between death and burial, 70 days during which the person who had occupied this tomb in life was systematically, carefully, and with enormous ritual investment transformed from a biological entity into something that could survive eternity. The process that accomplished this transformation is one of the most thoroughly documented and least casually understood procedures in the ancient world. And sitting here in the burial chamber's antechamber with your lamp performing its last serious work of illumination, surrounded by the objects that supported and sustained the process, it seems worth understanding what happened in that 70-day interval, because the body in the next room, the body that all of this architecture and theology and material preparation was assembled to protect, arrived here as the product of a process so elaborate, so technically demanding, and so philosophically considered that the word mummification does not begin to carry its weight. It started with the washing. The body was brought to a structure called the Ibu, the place of purification, where it was ritually cleansed with water from the Nile, an act that was simultaneously practical and symbolic, preparing the physical body for the procedures ahead and marking the transition from the realm of the living to the ritual space of transformation. The priests who performed this washing were specialists, operating within a professional hierarchy that the ancient sources describe with the thoroughness that Egyptians applied to every sufficiently important administrative domain. The chief embalmer held the title of Eri Seshta, overseer of mysteries, and wore a mask of Anubis during the most sacred phases of the work. Not as theatrical affectation but as a precise ritual statement, the god was present in the person of his representative, and the transformation being performed was divine work conducted through human hands. From the Ibu, the body moved to the Wabt, the place of embalming, and this is where the 70 days were spent in the most concentrated labor. The first and most critical step was the removal of the brain, performed through the nasal passage using a long-handled hook that was inserted through the nostril, advanced to the ethmoid bone at the back of the nasal cavity, and used to break through into the cranial vault, after which the liquefied brain tissue was drained out through the nose by tilting the head. The brain, unlike the abdominal organs, was not preserved. It was discarded, because the Egyptians understood intelligence and personality to reside in the heart, not the head, and the brain was accordingly treated as surplus biological material that needed to be removed to facilitate the desiccation process rather than as an organ worth preserving for eternity. The cranial cavity was subsequently rinsed with palm wine and packed with resin-soaked linen or, in some periods, resin itself injected in liquid form and allowed to harden. The abdominal incision was made on the left flank, a specific location that the sources describe with anatomical precision, using a stone blade, specifically flint rather than metal, a ritual conservatism that maintained a Stone Age technology within an otherwise thoroughly Bronze Age culture because the original sacred tools were made of flint and the divine precedent was not casually updated. The embalmer who made this incision was called the Ripper or the Slitter, a job title that the sources treat as necessary but ritually problematic, since the act of cutting a human body was understood as a form of violence against the person, even in service of their preservation. After the incision was made, the embalmer who made it was ceremonially driven away from the Wabt, chased off, pelted with stones, a ritual performance of communal disapproval that acknowledged the transgression even while accepting its necessity. He was then welcomed back. The sources are matter-of-fact about this sequence in a way that suggests it was standard procedure rather than genuine hostility, a ritual acknowledgement of moral complexity built into the professional protocol. The organs removed through this incision, liver, lungs, stomach, intestines, were processed separately, each washed, treated with natron, wrapped in linen, and placed in their corresponding canopic vessels, which you have already met in the previous room and whose current residents you have elected not to disturb. The body cavity, emptied of its organs, was rinsed with palm wine and with a liquid infusion of spices, then packed with temporary natron-soaked linen bags to begin the desiccation process from the inside while the external natron treatment worked on the body's exterior. Natron is the substance that makes Egyptian mummification possible, and understanding it reframes the entire process from something that sounds mystically exotic into something that is, at its foundation, applied chemistry of impressive precision. Natron is a naturally occurring salt mixture, primarily sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, with smaller proportions of sodium chloride and sodium sulfate found in deposits at several locations in Egypt, most famously at Wadi Nat Run in the Western Delta. It is a powerful desiccant and an effective inhibitor of bacterial decomposition, and the Egyptians discovered, through a process that historians still argue about, debating whether the discovery was gradual and empirical or sudden and accidental, that immersing a body in dry natron for a period of approximately 40 days would reduce its moisture content sufficiently to halt decomposition and produce a preserved form that could survive indefinitely in the appropriate environmental conditions. The body was placed on an embalming table, a slightly inclined surface that allowed fluids to drain, and covered completely in dry natron, packed around and over and under it in quantities that the sources suggest were considerable. There it remained for 40 of the 70 days. 40 days of chemical transformation, of the slow withdrawal of moisture from tissues that had spent a lifetime maintaining a precise internal water balance, of the patient work of salt chemistry on organic compounds that did not yield easily. The body that emerged from 40 days of natron treatment was dramatically reduced in weight, darkened in color, stiff and desiccated, the features sunken and the skin papery and rigid, recognizable as the person it had been, but transformed in a way that the Egyptians read as the first stage of divine transformation rather than as corruption or loss. The remaining 30 days were devoted to wrapping, and this phase of the process was the most labor-intensive, the most ritually dense, and the most materially extravagant of the entire 70-day procedure. The linen used for mummification was not ordinary cloth. Some of it was new, produced specifically for this purpose from high-quality flax. Some of it was household linen donated by the family, sheets and garments that had been in daily use during the person's life, repurposed for the burial with a logic that connected the wrapped body to the material world it was leaving. The quantity of linen required for a thorough wrapping was extraordinary. Analyses of unwrapped mummies have estimated the total linen content at anywhere from a few hundred to several thousand square meters, depending on the thoroughness of the preparation and the wealth of the deceased. The wrapping was not random bandaging. It was a structured, sequential procedure with specific wrappings for specific body parts, specific prayers spoken at each stage, specific amulets placed at specific anatomical locations as the layers built up. Fingers and toes were wrapped individually. The arms were wrapped, then bound to the body. The head received particular attention, the face sometimes covered with a cartonnage mask. Layers of linen stiffened with plaster, molded to the features and painted, that provided both a protective layer and an idealized portrait of the deceased for recognition purposes in the afterlife. Over the individual wrappings went larger linen sheets, secured with bands, and over those went the final shroud, typically a single large piece of linen inscribed with protective texts and the image of a protective goddess. Nut, the sky goddess, who swallowed the sun each night and gave birth to it each morning, whose embrace of the mummy echoed her daily embrace of the solar cycle. The resin. The entire surface of the completed mummy was coated with resin, dark, fragrant, sticky, applied hot, and allowed to harden into a protective shell that sealed the linen wrappings against moisture and biological intrusion. This resin application is responsible for the characteristic dark appearance of Egyptian mummies and also for the Arabic word mumia, from which we get mummy, a word that originally referred specifically to bitumen, the dark mineral pitch that early Arabic observers thought the black resinous surface of mummies was made of. The Egyptians used various resins: pine resin, pistacia resin, juniper resin, and true bitumen in later periods when the material became available through trade with the Dead Sea region. The chemistry of these resin coatings, analyzed by modern conservation scientists, reveals the geographic range of ancient Egyptian trade networks in extraordinary molecular detail. Throughout the wrapping process, priests read continuously from funerary texts. The transformation of the body from biological entity to eternal vessel required a continuous soundtrack of sacred language, the words themselves participating in the transformation by describing and thereby enacting it. This is a principle of Egyptian ritual thought called the performative power of language. The spoken or written word does not merely represent reality but constitutes it, in the appropriate ritual context, through the act of utterance. The priests were not narrating the transformation. They were performing it, their words as operative as the natron and the linen and the resin, each element necessary to the complete process. The opening of the mouth ceremony, mentioned earlier in the context of divine images, and equally applicable to the mummy itself, was the final and most critical ritual of the burial sequence, performed at the tomb entrance on the day of interment. A priest, wearing the Anubis mask, touched the wrapped face of the mummy with a series of ritual implements: an adze, a chisel, a finger of Anubis, while speaking the formulae that restored the mummy's sensory faculties. The mouth was open to eat and speak. The eyes were open to see. The ears were open to hear. The nostrils were open to breathe. The hands were open to receive offerings. Each restoration was accompanied by its corresponding text, and the completion of the ceremony transformed the mummy from a beautifully preserved biological object into an active spiritual entity, an Akh, an effective spirit, capable of participating in the afterlife economy of offerings, judgment, and divine companionship that the tomb's entire apparatus was designed to support. The body now in the next room arrived at this point via all of that, via the hook and the natron and the 40 days and the linen and the resin and the opening of the mouth, and was placed in its nested coffins with the same careful orientation discussed earlier, positioned on the sarcophagus base with a precision that reflects the astronomical and theological logic of the tomb's overall design. The innermost coffin, pressed close around the mummy like a second skin of gilded wood, is painted with the same gods and texts that cover the walls around it, creating a continuous sacred environment that surrounds the deceased at every scale simultaneously: the macrocosm of the tomb chamber, the mesocosm of the nested coffins, the microcosm of the amulet-wrapped body within, each layer a complete protective system in itself and all three functioning together as an integrated spiritual technology. The peculiar scholarly footnote that tends to lodge in people's minds when they learn about Egyptian mummification concerns the question of what happened to the embalming materials, the natron-soaked linen pads, the temporary stuffing removed from the body cavity, the fluids drained during the process, the materials used to clean the embalming table. These materials, having been in contact with the sacred body during its transformation, were themselves considered ritually significant, too holy to be discarded casually, too messy to be placed in the tomb proper. The solution was embalming caches, dedicated deposits, buried near the tomb, containing the used materials of the mummification process in sealed pottery vessels. The discovery of such caches near royal tombs has provided some of the most detailed chemical evidence available about ancient embalming practice, and the cache discovered near the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1907, containing linen bags of natron, floral collars from the funeral feast, and sealed jars of what proved to be the residue of the embalming oils, allowed researchers to reconstruct aspects of his burial preparation that the tomb itself did not reveal. Somewhere in the room beyond the doorway ahead of you, all of that work, all 70 days of it, all the hands and the prayers and the chemistry and the ritual precision, is lying in its nested coffins in its stone sarcophagus, doing what it was prepared to do, lasting, persisting, maintaining, in the dark and the still air and the mineral silence, the form of a person who lived and breathed and ate dried figs and possibly commissioned a boat painting and definitely had feelings about the 42 assessors that we will never fully recover. Your lamp is producing light that can only be described as symbolic at this point, present in intention more than in illumination, a flame so small that it casts more shadow than light and has begun to make the shadows in the doorway ahead look like something other than shadows. You cup your hand around it, steadies slightly. The smell of the nearly exhausted oil mingles with the kifi and the resin and the ancient mineral air, adding one more layer to the olfactory record of this space. One more doorway, one more threshold. The work of 70 days is on the other side of it, waiting with the patience of something that has already been waiting for 3,000 years and has made its peace with the concept. You step forward. The necropolis police knew you were coming before you did. This is not a metaphor and not a supernatural claim. It is a straightforward statement about the organizational sophistication of the institution that protected these tombs in antiquity, an institution so thoroughly documented in the surviving administrative record that we know not just that it existed but how it was staffed, how it communicated internally, how it responded to incidents, and how catastrophically it sometimes failed. The Medjay, the paramilitary force that served as the primary security apparatus of the New Kingdom necropolis, were among the most professionally organized law enforcement bodies in the ancient world, and the fact that you are currently inside a sealed royal tomb without authorization would, in their operational era, have triggered a response chain of impressive efficiency that would have ended badly for you in ways that the 42 assessors would subsequently have found very interesting to discuss. The Medjay began their institutional life as a people rather than a profession, a semi-nomadic group from the eastern deserts of Nubia who were incorporated into Egyptian military service during the Middle Kingdom and proved so effective as scouts, trackers, and desert fighters that their name gradually became synonymous with the function they performed rather than the ethnic group that originally performed it. By the New Kingdom, the Medjay who patrolled the West Bank necropolis at Thebes were a mixed background professional force whose connection to the original Nubian group was largely nominal. They were Egyptian civil servants with a specific portfolio, which happened to include keeping unauthorized people away from the royal dead. Their headquarters was a structure called the Kenbet, a combined administrative office and judicial court located at the edge of the necropolis, and from this base they maintained a patrol system whose routes and schedules were recorded with the same bureaucratic thoroughness that characterized every other aspect of Egyptian administration. The patrol records that survive from Deir el-Medina and the surrounding necropolis area, those remarkable administrative documents on ostraca and papyrus that have given us such an intimate view of daily life in the necropolis community, include references to Medjay activities that range from the routine to the dramatic. Routine entries note the inspection of tomb seals, the verification that no unauthorized entry had occurred since the previous patrol, the checking of the boundary markers that delineated the sacred precinct. Dramatic entries describe the discovery of break-in attempts, the pursuit of suspects across the desert hills, the apprehension and examination of individuals found in the necropolis without appropriate authorization, and the subsequent referral of cases to the Kenbet court for adjudication. The adjudication, it should be noted, was not gentle. Tomb robbery in ancient Egypt was not treated as property crime. It was treated as a crime against the cosmic order, against the state, against the gods, and against the dead simultaneously, a convergence of offenses that produced correspondingly severe consequences. The Great Tomb Robbery Papyri of the late 20th dynasty, a series of administrative documents recording the investigation and prosecution of a systematic tomb robbing operation that targeted royal burials in the Valley of the Kings during the reign of Ramesses IX and his successors, provide the most detailed surviving account of how the system worked when it was under serious stress. The documents record the testimony of accused robbers, the counter-testimony of necropolis officials accused of complicity, the physical inspection of damaged tombs, and the ultimate fate of the convicted participants in terms that leave no ambiguity about the seriousness with which the crime was regarded. Convicted tomb robbers in ancient Egypt faced penalties that escalated with the severity of the violation. Minor offenses, unauthorized presence in the necropolis, possession of items that might have come from a tomb, could result in beating, a punishment administered with a cane to the soles of the feet in a procedure called bastinado that was the standard Egyptian response to a range of administrative infractions, and which the records treat with the casual matter-of-factness of a parking fine. More serious violations, actual penetration of a sealed tomb, removal of burial goods, physical disturbance of a mummy, warranted impalement, a form of execution that the Egyptian legal record describes without flinching and that the Great Tomb Robbery Papyri reference in connection with several of the convicted perpetrators. The state's message about the sanctity of the royal dead was expressed in the most emphatic physical terms available. What is historically remarkable, and what the Great Tomb Robbery Papyri document with an honesty that reflects the administrative seriousness of the investigation rather than any particular commitment to self-incrimination, is how thoroughly the robbery networks had penetrated the official apparatus meant to prevent them. Among those implicated in the late 20th dynasty robberies were necropolis scribes who had access to tomb records, medjay officers who had patrol knowledge, and mortuary priests whose access to tomb interiors for ritual purposes provided cover for systematic looting. The investigation uncovered a supply chain of remarkable organizational sophistication. Robbers who penetrated the tombs, middlemen who received and redistributed the stolen goods, dealers who melted down gold objects and sold the raw metal, and officials who looked away from the evidence in exchange for a share of the proceeds. Historians still argue about the extent to which the late Ramesside tomb robberies represented a systemic collapse of the necropolis security apparatus or a more targeted corruption of specific individuals within an otherwise functional system. But the scale of what the papyri document suggests the former rather than the latter. You are, from the perspective of the medjay operational framework, a tomb robber. Not by intention, you have not removed anything, you have not disturbed the mummy, you have not melted down any gold, but by the simple legal and spatial fact of your presence inside a sealed royal tomb without authorization. The distinction between the curious unauthorized visitor and the systematic looter is one that the medjay's operational procedures did not particularly incentivize. You were found inside. The seal was broken. The subsequent conversation at the Kenbet court would have been brief and the outcome largely predetermined. The irony that the most famous tomb robbers in history were, arguably, the archaeologists of the 19th and early 20th centuries is one that the field of Egyptology has spent the better part of a century processing with varying degrees of institutional candor. The methods by which many of the great museum collections of Egyptian antiquities were assembled, the removal of objects from their archaeological context without adequate documentation, the export of material under permit systems that were simultaneously legal and exploitative, the physical damage caused to tombs and mummies by excavation techniques that prioritize spectacular finds over stratigraphic integrity, share more than a little DNA with the behavior that the medjay were organized to prevent. Howard Carter, whose meticulous excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 set a new standard for archaeological documentation, was himself briefly suspended from his position by Egyptian authorities after an incident in 1905 in which he supported the rights of Egyptian excavation workers against a group of French tourists who had forced their way into a site. A nuanced situation whose moral geometry continues to be discussed. though Carter's instinct in that particular case seems to have been on the right side of it. The living guardians of the tombs were not only the official Medjay. The mortuary priests, the Hemnetjer, servants of the god, and their subordinate colleagues who maintained the various levels of the mortuary cult, had a complex and sometimes contradictory relationship with the tombs under their care. Their official function was to perform the ongoing ritual maintenance that kept the tomb's spiritual economy functioning. Daily offerings of food and drink left at the false door or the offering chapel, the recitation of protective formulae, the burning of incense, the periodic inspection of the burial to ensure its physical integrity. This ongoing priestly service was funded by an endowment established at the time of burial, an allocation of agricultural land whose income was specifically dedicated to supporting the mortuary cult in perpetuity, and the theoretical expectation was that this service would continue forever, sustaining the deceased soul through an eternity of divine companionship and ritual nourishment. In practice, mortuary cults tended to decline within a few generations of the original burial. The endowments were absorbed into other institutional funds. The dedicated priests were reassigned or their positions simply not filled as the original family's connection to the tomb faded across the generations. By the late New Kingdom, many of the older royal tombs that had once been maintained by active mortuary cults were already in a state of ritual abandonment. Their offerings long since ceased, their priestly staff dispersed. The tombs that survived relatively intact into the modern period survived not because their mortuary institutions functioned as intended but despite the failure of those institutions. Preserved by the same accident of sealed darkness and dry desert air that preserved everything else, including the evidence of the cult's own disappearance. The tomb robbers who operated in the Valley of the Kings during the late Ramesside period were not, for the most part, outsiders. The Great Tomb Robbery papyri make clear that many of the actual penetrations were carried out by people with insider knowledge, people who knew which tombs had been inadequately sealed after earlier robberies, which corridors led where, which chambers contained the most valuable material. Some of the accused robbers were themselves necropolis workers, men whose daily professional lives were spent in the same hills where the tombs were cut and who had accumulated, through years of proximity, a detailed, practical knowledge of the necropolis geography that no amount of official security could entirely counteract. The knowledge of where the tombs were, what they contained, and how to enter them was precisely the kind of information that the original state secrecy around tomb construction was meant to prevent from becoming widely distributed, and the evidence suggests that this containment effort was, over the long term, only partially successful. The specific technique most commonly employed by ancient tomb robbers was not the dramatic explosive breach of popular imagination but something considerably more patient and labor-intensive: tunneling. Using the same copper tools that the official tomb builders used, working at night or in the pre-dawn hours when Medjay patrols were thinnest, robber gangs cut new passages through the bedrock to bypass sealed entrances or to access burial chambers directly without traversing the defended official corridors. The quality of some of this tunneling, documented in the robbery investigation records and visible in several Valley of the Kings tombs today, is technically impressive. The robbers could follow a natural rock fault with the accuracy of professional quarrymen, minimizing their labor while maximizing penetration depth. This was skilled work performed under significant time pressure and mortal risk, and the fact that it was undertaken repeatedly, across decades of increasing security response, suggests that the value of what was being sought was sufficient to justify the investment and the danger. What happened to the contents of the robbed tombs is a story told partly in the Great Robbery papyri and partly in the material record of Egyptian antiquities collections worldwide. Gold was melted down almost immediately. It was the most liquid asset in the ancient economy, recognizable in any form and acceptable in any transaction, and preserving it in its original manufactured form only created evidence of its provenance. Linen was sold in the local market. Shabtis and smaller amulets were sold individually to a trade network whose customers apparently included people who simply wanted the objects for their own spiritual protection, regardless of their original ownership. The larger wooden furniture was broken down for its components, the gilded panels stripped, the wooden frames broken up for reuse. In a society where resources were finite and the material inputs to luxury goods were expensive and geographically constrained, a royal burial assemblage represented an extraordinary concentration of raw material that the economics of the late Ramesside period made increasingly difficult to leave undisturbed. The mummies themselves were disturbed primarily in search of the amulets wrapped within their bandaging. Those carefully placed protective objects of gold and precious stone, whose value in raw material terms was significant, and whose specific ritual function made them attractive to a market that included both people who wanted the raw materials and people who wanted the amulets themselves. On the theory that an amulet that had been ritually activated and placed on a royal mummy was probably more spiritually potent than one that had merely been purchased from a dealer. The physical condition of royal mummies discovered by modern archaeologists reflects this history. Many show evidence of ancient unwrapping and rewrapping, of damage consistent with a search for hidden amulets, of disturbance and partial restoration by the necropolis officials who periodically entered compromised tombs to assess and repair the damage. The mummy of Ramesses II, discovered in the Deir el-Bahari cache where it had been moved by the priests for safekeeping after its original tomb was compromised, shows evidence of ancient rewrapping over damage caused by exactly this kind of amulet extraction. You are thinking about all of this, the Medjay patrols, the robber gangs with their patient copper tools, the priests performing their dwindling rounds of offerings, the investigators from the Kenbet working their way through implicated officials with the methodical attention of people who suspect the corruption goes quite far up the administrative hierarchy. Because the sounds outside this tomb, which you have not been hearing because there are none, are the silence left by all of that activity ceasing. The patrols stopped. The priests stopped. The robbers were caught or moved on or simply ran out of things worth the risk of taking. And then the desert went quiet and stayed quiet, for century after century, the sand building up against the sealed entrance, the darkness inside maintaining itself with perfect, self-sufficient patience, until the seal broke earlier tonight under your hands. You are the latest in a very long line of unauthorized visitors to this space, and the question of what distinguishes you from the others, the robbers, the priests, the investigators, the archaeologists, is one that the tomb, in its absolute and continuing indifference, declines to answer. Deeper in, past the last doorway, the lamp's diminishing light has reached what it will reach, and you are going to have to decide soon whether to advance into that final room on almost no illumination or stay where you are and wait for a dawn that will not reach you here. You think about the Medjay. You think about the Kenbet court. You think about the penalty for unauthorized entry and the even more pointed penalty for the specific offense of disturbing a royal burial. Then you think about the room ahead, and the 3,000 years of darkness it has been keeping, and the fact that you have come this far. You take one more breath of the thin, ancient, carefully composed air. You go in. The burial chamber receives you the way the desert receives rain, without adjustment, without acknowledgement, simply incorporating your presence into its existing state as one more thing that is happening in a space that has been happening for a very long time without you. The ceiling is higher here than anywhere else in the tomb. You can feel the volume of the space before your failing lamp confirms it. The air moving differently, the acoustic signature shifting into something roomier and more resonant. The sound of your own breathing returning from walls that are further away than they have been for hours. You hold the lamp up and turn slowly, and the light does its last serious work of the evening, painting the walls in a warm, unsteady gold that is almost certainly the most accurate illumination this room has received since the priests left 3,000 years ago and pulled the darkness in behind them like a door. The sarcophagus is at the center of the room. Of course it is. It is made of red granite, Aswan granite, that particular warm-toned stone quarried from the first cataract of the Nile and transported by river barge to the Valley of the Kings. A logistical undertaking that required organizational capacity of a kind that makes your own journey here, complicated as it has been, look straightforward. The granite box is massive in a way that the word massive does not adequately prepare you for. Not tall, exactly, but dense, presenting to the room a weight and solidity that seem to reorganize the space around it, the way a very large and very calm animal organizes the space it occupies. The lid, a slightly darker rectangle of the same stone, sits on top with a precision of fit that required either extraordinary craftsmanship or extraordinary patience or both. And the join between lid and box is so tight that the darkness inside it is absolute even with your lamp held directly against the stone. The walls of the burial chamber are the most fully realized decorative program in the tomb. Where the entry corridor offered preliminary texts and the antechamber presented the judgment scene and the assembly of gods, the burial chamber contains what the Egyptians called the Amjuat in its complete form. All 12 hours of the sun god's nightly journey through the underworld, arranged in registers around all four walls so that the deceased, lying in the sarcophagus at the center, is literally surrounded by the complete cosmological narrative of death, transformation, and resurrection. The structure of the amduat reflects the Egyptian understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear. Not a sequence of events moving toward a conclusion but a pattern of recurrence, death and rebirth happening not once but every night. The darkness not a problem to be solved but a process to be navigated. The resurrection of the sun each morning not a miracle but a scheduled event, reliable as the Nile's inundation, built into the operating system of the cosmos. The first hour of the amduat shows the sun god Ra entering the underworld in his solar bark, accompanied by a retinue of protective deities, greeted by the inhabitants of the first region of the Duat. The subsequent hours proceed through landscapes of increasing strangeness, regions populated by serpents of extraordinary length, by gods who exist only for the duration of the sun's passage and then return to inert dormancy until the next night, by the souls of the blessed dead who receive the light of the passing bark as their only illumination and return to darkness when it moves on. The fifth hour contains the image of the sun god at his most vulnerable, passing over the body of the primordial serpent Apophis, chaos itself, given reptilian form, the fundamental threat to cosmic order that must be defeated every single night for the sun to rise again. The sixth hour is the midnight moment, the deepest point of the journey, where Ra's soul and his physical form reunite briefly in the deepest darkness, gathering the energy for the transformation that the remaining hours will enact. You follow the sequence around the walls, moving your lamp slowly along each register, and the painted hours of the night unfold before you in sequence. A complete cosmological story arranged to be read by a person lying down, looking up in the dark. The deceased in the sarcophagus before you was meant to experience this narrative as accompaniment rather than observation. The amduat on the walls was not a text to be read but an environment to be inhabited. The complete cycle of the night surrounding the wrapped and anointed body the way the night sky surrounds the earth. The imagery not decorating the burial chamber but constituting it, making the chamber itself into a model of the underworld through which the deceased could navigate using the walls as a map. Historians still argue about the precise moment at which the ancient Egyptians developed the specific theological synthesis that the royal tombs represent, the integration of solar theology, with its emphasis on the daily cycle of death and rebirth, with Osirian theology, with its emphasis on the resurrection of the dead through divine intervention and ritual preparation. The two systems coexisted in Egyptian religious thought for centuries in a productive tension that the funerary literature negotiated with considerable sophistication, the deceased simultaneously becoming Osiris, adopting the identity of the resurrected god as a template for their own resurrection, and accompanying Ra, joining the solar journey as a member of the divine crew. The burial chamber around you holds both theologies simultaneously, the Osirian judgment and resurrection in the antechamber, the solar journey here, the deceased positioned at the intersection of both narratives, eligible for both destinies. The 12th hour of the amduat, which occupies the wall toward which the head of the sarcophagus is oriented, shows the solar bark emerging from the underworld into the eastern sky, being born again through the body of the sky goddess, the sun rising with the punctuality of 3,000 years of reliable performance. The final image is dawn. The final image, painted in this sealed room that has never seen actual dawn, has been the first thing the deceased's Ka, their vital spirit, which the Egyptians understood to remain in the vicinity of the tomb and require the ongoing nourishment of offerings, would see upon entering the burial chamber. Not darkness even here, the promise of morning, built into the walls of a room that has no morning, rendered in pigments that have held their color in the dark for 3 millennia, without the sun that inspired them. The lamp is at the very end of its oil now, the flame a minimal thing, blue at its base and barely yellow at its tip, consuming the last fraction of fuel with the careful efficiency of something that knows it is nearly done. In this light, or in this almost light, this suggestion of illumination, the burial chamber has achieved an atmospheric quality that no restoration and no electric installation has ever replicated or will. The painted walls move with the flicker. The granite of the sarcophagus drinks the warmth and returns nothing. The shaptis in the antechamber, the canopic jars with their divine watchers, the heart scarab in its linen layers, the astronomical ceiling with its yellow stars. All of it exists right now in the last minutes of the only light this room has seen in 3,000 years, and the knowledge of what is about to happen to that light produces a feeling that has no clean name in any language you speak. The quirky footnote that your oxygen-reduced, headache-bothered, thoroughly overwhelmed brain produces at this precise moment, because the brain never fully stops producing footnotes, which is one of its more endearing qualities, is that the ancient Egyptians had a specific term for the moment of falling asleep. They called it the small death. Sleep, in Egyptian theological understanding, was a nightly rehearsal for death, the soul partially departing the body, the senses dimming, the self becoming temporarily inaccessible in a way that paralleled the more permanent inaccessibility of death closely enough that the two states shared vocabulary, shared imagery, and shared ritual attention. The headrest that you noticed in the burial goods room was not merely a sleeping aid but a protective object, specifically inscribed to guard the sleeper during the dangerous hours of the small death, when the partially vacated body was vulnerable to hostile spiritual attention. The connection between sleep and death is one that most human cultures have recognized and formalized in some way, but the Egyptians gave it a theological precision that made the analogy operational rather than merely poetic. If sleep is a small death, then waking is a small resurrection, and the sun rising each morning is the cosmic enactment of the same process that the sleeping person undergoes each dawn, a pattern of descent and return, darkness and light, cessation and renewal that operates simultaneously at the personal, the natural, and the divine scale. The tomb you are sitting in is, among its many other functions, a meditation on this pattern, a space designed to facilitate the most important waking in the history of a specific individual, the resurrection that all the preparation and the theology and the 70 days of labor and the 3,000 years of darkness were in service of. You sit down on the floor of the burial chamber with your back against the cool granite of the sarcophagus. Not irreverently or not entirely irreverently, but with the simple animal need of a body that has been crawling and climbing and balancing on ledges and sitting on hard stone for the better part of a night and requires, urgently, the support of something solid. The granite is cool. The floor is cool. The air is still. Your headache has reached the state of familiarity where it registers as background rather than event. The flame goes out. The darkness is, there is no other word, complete. Not dark in the way a room is dark when the lights go off and your eyes slowly identify the edges of objects by the light from the gap under the door. Dark in the way the word was used before electricity existed, before the assumption of ambient light was built into every human structure. Dark in the way the inside of the earth is dark, absolute, physical, total, a substance rather than an absence. You hold your hand in front of your face and there is no sensation of looking at anything. Your hand is there. You know it is there. It is invisible. And in this darkness, something unexpected happens. You are not afraid. You have been managing fear all night. The fear of the pit trap, the fear of the failing lamp, the fear of the thin air and the painted eyes and the painted Amit waiting beside its painted scales. All of that fear was navigational, purposeful, the correct biological response to a series of genuine hazards that required attention and response. But this darkness, this final, total, sealed darkness with the weight of the granite against your back and the weight of 3,000 years of night around you, this darkness is different. It has a quality that the word darkness does not carry well, a quality closer to stillness or completion, the feeling of arriving somewhere that has been waiting for you, not with menace but with the patient recognition of a place that understands what you are. You are a living thing in a space built for the dead, and the space is not hostile to you. It is simply true. It is simply itself, this careful, elaborate, lovingly constructed argument for the persistence of the self beyond the moment of cessation. This 3,000-year-old act of hope rendered in granite and gold and pigment and sacred text and the labor of people whose names we sometimes know and often do not. Panub with his excellent skills and impressive misconduct. The unnamed painter of the astronomical ceiling who went home and stood in the sun. The scribe who recorded the first strike in human history with the careful handwriting of someone who knew the document might last. The embalmer who made the cut and was chased away and welcomed back. The priests who read the texts as the linen layers built up, their words doing their operative work in the dark. All of them are here too in the most meaningful sense. Their work is here, which is where their work was always going to end up, and that work is extraordinary. The darkness holds you. The granite holds you. The still air, thin and ancient and full of invisible biology and the molecular residue of kifi and cedar and sacred oil, holds you. The eyes on the walls, which you can no longer see but which have not stopped watching, hold you. The 12 hours of the Amjuet proceed around you in the painted dark, the solar bark moving through its cosmic itinerary with the reliability of 3,000 years of nightly repetition. Apophis defeated again in the 5th hour, the midnight reunion accomplished in the 6th. The dawn assembled in the 12th with the unhurried confidence of a process that has never yet failed to deliver. You breathe. The breath echoes very slightly off the stone walls and comes back to you, warm and familiar, the most intimate sound in the world in the most silent place in the world. You close your eyes, which changes nothing about what you see, and everything about how it feels. And here, at the very bottom of the dark, is where the night becomes something else entirely. Let the stone hold the weight of all your thinking. Let the painted gods maintain their vigil. They are very good at it. They have been practicing for 3,000 years. They do not need your help. Let the 12 hours of the night proceed in their painted sequence on the walls above you. That ancient argument for the return of the light, still being made, still as confident as it ever was. The air is cool and still and carries the faintest ghost of kifi, that ancient remedy for the restless mind, drifting on no current at all, simply present. Your breathing has slowed without your noticing, deepened without your deciding to deepen it, following the rhythm of a very old and very quiet place that knows something about the relationship between the letting go and the return. The darkness is not empty. It is full of the care that built it, the love that furnished it, the hope that sealed it, the patience that has kept it for 3 millennia against the moment when someone would sit in it and understand, for just a moment, that the distance between the very old and the very present is thinner than the stone that separates them. We are all making the same journey in different languages, through different architectures of belief, toward the same horizon. The Egyptians called it the Ake, the place where two things touch. You are touching it now. The solar bark moves through the 6th hour, the midnight moment, the deepest dark before the turn. Your breathing is very slow now, very soft, the smallest sound in a very large silence. The 12th hour waits at the edges of the painted walls, patient as granite, certain as sunrise, holding the dawn that this sealed room has been keeping safe since the last torch went out and the last priest left and the last footstep faded into the desert above, 3,000 years ago. It will keep it a little longer. You are here. You are safe. You are held by something that has been holding things a very long time and has not dropped one yet. Sleep well.